Richard Caldwell, billionaire CEO with a reputation for ruthless control, stormed into the hangar, eyes blazing. "Marcus, I need you to stay late. No excuses," he barked, voice cutting through the hum of machinery. Marcus Hayes, the company's lead mechanic, wiped his hands on a rag and met Richard's glare steadily. "I'm done for the day," he said, firm but calm. The words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. Richard's face twisted with fury. Without hesitation, he fired Marcus on the spot. Yet in his arrogance, Richard had no idea that this single act would set off a chain of events even he couldn't control. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to this channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness is something you should never have let it happen. From the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the CEO, Richard Caldwell, watched the factory floor like a hawk surveying prey. Every machine whirred, every worker moved, and yet, somehow, nothing met his exacting standards. Richard wasn't just a perfectionist, he was a control freak, the kind of man who believed that deadlines bent to his will, not the other way around. In his crisp navy suit, polished shoes, and expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, he exuded authority, but not respect. The air around him crackled with tension, a living thing that the employees could feel the moment they stepped inside the plant. Across the floor, bending over the engine of a gleaming private jet, was Marcus Hayes, the lead mechanic. Calm, meticulous, and unflinchingly principled, Marcus believed that machinery deserved respect, that every bolt and wire had a story. He didn't chase overtime or compromise safety for the sake of a paycheck. In a world where greed often drowned integrity, Marcus stood like a silent lighthouse, guiding himself by an unshakable moral compass. Supporting staff hustled between their stations, janitors wiping surfaces, assistants shuffling paperwork, engineers arguing over schematics, each move watched and often judged by Richard. Whispers floated through the air like static electricity. "Did you see what he said to Marcus?" one engineer murmured. "He can't keep firing everyone who won't bend to him forever," another replied under their breath. Peer pressure was subtle but relentless. Everyone knew speaking up risked being blacklisted, yet staying silent felt like a slow surrender of one's own dignity. Even the board of directors had begun to murmur about Richard's management style. At weekly meetings, they questioned his decisions, though never directly to his face. "He's brilliant, no doubt," one senior executive said privately, "but there's a fine line between control and chaos, and he's skating on the edge." Their concern wasn't just corporate prudence, it was a fear of the inevitable blowback from a leader who ruled with fear rather than vision. Marcus, aware of all this, worked methodically, refusing to let the gossip, the CEO's ever-watchful gaze, or the subtle threats from above shake him. He measured every torque, checked every connection, and spoke up when corners were cut. To him, the machines didn't lie, and neither did the principles he lived by. That unwavering commitment, however, made him a target in Richard's eyes, a challenge to the authority that had always gone unchallenged. It was a high-stakes, high-pressure environment, a factory where one wrong move could cost millions, and yet the human drama rivaled the machine's precision. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every decision, big or small, added layers to an invisible tension stretching from the CEO's office to the hangar floor, setting the stage for a confrontation that nobody in the building could yet imagine. The hum of the factory seemed to pause for a heartbeat as Richard Caldwell strode across the hangar, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. "Marcus," he barked, voice sharp enough to slice through the air, "I need you to stay late. There's no excuse. Overtime now." Marcus straightened, wiped grease from his hands, and met the CEO's glare without flinching. "I'm sorry, sir," he said evenly, his tone firm but respectful. "I've already put in a full day, and working overtime tonight would compromise safety checks. I won't risk it." A silence fell like a heavy curtain. Machines whirred in the background, employees froze mid-step, and even the usual chatter of the hangar seemed to vanish. Richard's face went red, half with fury, half with disbelief. How dare this man refuse him? In Richard's world, power was absolute, compliance was currency, and resistance was unacceptable. "Pack your tools. You're done here," Richard snapped. The words echoed like gunfire through the room. Marcus didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply nodded, collected his things, and walked toward the exit with quiet dignity. The reaction among the staff was immediate, electric. Some whispered nervously, glancing at each other, wondering who might be next. Did he really just fire him for that? one junior engineer muttered, eyes wide. Others offered subtle signs of support, head nods, a quiet, good on him, but no one spoke openly. Fear and loyalty collided, creating a tension that was palpable, almost suffocating. Richard, however, barely registered the murmurs. His pride was wounded, his ego bruised. In his mind, Marcus's refusal was an insult, a challenge to the authority that had always gone unquestioned. He dismissed the ripple of unease spreading through his employees as trivial. He was, after all, untouchable. The warning signs, the small signals that maybe, just maybe, his obsession with control was a liability, were drowned out by a storm of anger and arrogance. And yet, in that moment, an invisible seed of reckoning had been planted. Neither Richard nor the employees could know it yet, but the choice of one principled mechanic to stand his ground would set off a chain of events that would challenge power, test survival, and redefine respect in ways no one in the hangar could have predicted. The next morning, Richard Caldwell's penthouse buzzed with the sterile energy of a man used to controlling everything and everyone. He strode through the marble-floored lobby of his private hangar, a leather briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, eyes glinting with impatience. Today was critical, a high-profile board meeting in New York that could make or break a multi-million-dollar deal. Everything had to be perfect, and in his mind, he alone dictated what perfect looked like. The private jet gleamed under the hangar lights, its engines silent yet humming with latent power. Richard's entourage had already boarded. His assistant, a couple of board members flying in for the meeting, and, against his better judgment, his teenage daughter, who had insisted on tagging along. Richard gave the pilot a sharp nod, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken demands, and climbed aboard. Marcus Hayes's absence hovered like a shadow over him, an unspoken reminder of defiance and lost control. Once airborne, the first minutes felt routine. The city below shrank, and the clouds swirled around the cabin like nothing could touch them. Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers, exuding confidence. But the jet was not as flawless as it appeared. A faint, almost imperceptible grinding sound came from the rear engines, a sound the pilot noted but dismissed as a minor mechanical quirk. Then, the warning lights flickered. Small, yellow triangles that shouldn't have been there blinked insistently on the cockpit panel. The pilot frowned, hands tightening on the controls. "We've got a small electrical irregularity," he said, voice calm but tense. Richard barely registered it, waving off concern. "Handle it. We're on a schedule," he barked, dismissing the warning with arrogance only wealth could buy. Yet in the back of the jet, Marcus's meticulous inspection the previous day floated through Richard's mind like an echo he didn't want to hear. Though he had fired Marcus, the mechanic's work had always been precise, almost obsessive. Had someone, an employee jealous of Marcus, resentful of the CEO's tyranny, interfered with the systems? Or had Marcus, in his principled stand, left a minor issue unaddressed in quiet protest? The thought made Richard tense, though he would never admit it aloud. The grinding grew louder. The warning lights switched to red. Panic was a whisper at the edge of Richard's mind, but he shoved it aside. He was Richard Caldwell, untouchable, unflappable, untamed. He had conquered boardrooms, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar negotiations. This, he thought, was just another minor inconvenience. Then came the first real tremor. A violent shudder ran through the fuselage. Passengers gasped. His daughter clutched the armrest, eyes wide. The assistant gripped the seat in front of her, knuckles white, a low groan escaping her lips. One of the board members whispered a prayer under his breath. Richard's jaw clenched, his pride battling the creeping panic. He was trained to lead, to make split-second decisions. But here, thousands of feet above the ground, in a situation utterly beyond his control, his authority was meaningless. The pilot's voice, calm but urgent, cut through the tense air. "We're losing altitude. Engine 1 is failing. We need to attempt an emergency descent." The cabin fell silent except for the roar of the remaining engine and the sudden, terrifying creak of stressed metal. Richard felt a cold wash of fear for the first time in decades. He glanced at his daughter, her face pale, lips pressed together, eyes filled with trust and terror. He realized with crushing clarity that his obsession with power, with control, had blinded him to the real stakes, human lives. His principles, his arrogance, his unshakable ego, they were useless now. Flashbacks tore through his mind. Marcus had warned about overworked systems, cutting corners, safety protocols that Richard had ignored in his drive for speed and efficiency. The mechanic's refusal to stay late yesterday suddenly felt prophetic, almost like a moral compass Richard had mocked. He had dismissed it, scorned it, but now, the consequences were undeniable. Meanwhile, the jet fought the sky. Turbulence rocked the cabin violently. Oxygen masks dangled, and alarms screamed in a chorus of red. Panic spread through the passengers in waves, but Richard's mind was split between terror and clarity. The mystery, had this been negligence, sabotage, or sheer coincidence, drove him to scrutinize every indicator on the console, every flicker of light. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Each second, a pendulum swinging between survival and disaster. The pilot wrestled with controls, trying to stabilize the failing engine while keeping the descent manageable. Richard, sitting tensely, tried to project calm, his mind racing, emergency protocols, possible crash scenarios, even the board meeting he had scheduled. The juxtaposition of trivial business against mortal danger was jarring, almost surreal. Around him, emotions collided. His daughter whispered reassurances to herself, the assistant muttered frantically, and one board member began assessing their survival chances aloud. Richard felt something unfamiliar: humility. Adrenaline sharpened his awareness of every sound, every movement, every human reaction in the cabin. He realized leadership wasn't about intimidation or domination, it was about presence, decision-making, and care under pressure. The jet shuddered again. Metal groaned. The engines protested. The pilot's calmness was a thin veneer over immense strain. Every second felt like a lifetime as the aircraft fought gravity and mechanical failure simultaneously. Richard gripped the armrest, heart pounding, visions of Marcus, the fired mechanic, flashing in his mind, a reminder of human integrity versus hubris. And just as despair threatened to overwhelm, a faint glimmer of hope appeared. The pilot had found a temporary stabilizing adjustment. The descent became controlled, though rough, and the passengers clung to that fragile thread of survival. But Richard knew the ordeal was far from over. Mid-air, thousands of feet above the earth, surrounded by uncertainty, one man's arrogance and another man's principles were locked in a life-or-death struggle, one that would change everyone aboard forever. The roar of the engines had become a nightmare soundtrack, a violent symphony of metal and fire. Sparks flickered in the cockpit, red warning lights screaming their insistence. Richard Caldwell's knuckles were white around the armrests, his mind spinning between panic and clarity. The jet was critically damaged, and every second in the air felt like a gamble with death. The pilot's face was tense, beads of sweat streaking his forehead, hands shaking ever so slightly as he wrestled with the controls. "We've got a full engine failure on the left side," he said, voice clipped and precise. "We can try a controlled crash landing, but it's going to be rough. Brace yourself." Richard's chest tightened. Years of power, influence, and wealth, the very things that had defined him, were meaningless in this moment. The hubris that had led him to fire Marcus for standing up to him now mocked him from the shadows. Every decision, every demand made in arrogance, every corner cut in the pursuit of efficiency, flashed through his mind like a lightning storm. He had treated people like cogs in his machine, and now the machine itself was fighting back. He glanced around the cabin. His daughter clutched her seatbelt, eyes wide, trembling. The assistant prayed quietly. A board member whispered, "God, make it stop," voice cracking. The chaos wasn't just mechanical, it was human. Lives hung in the balance, and Richard knew that panicking, losing control, or trying to dominate the situation would make things exponentially worse. He took a deep breath, forcing clarity over panic. Decisions had to be fast, precise, and collaborative. The pilot's skill was the difference between survival and catastrophe, and Richard had no right to interfere, yet he had to act, to do something meaningful. He scanned the cockpit instruments, attempting to understand the mechanics enough to assist without causing harm. A jolt rocked the plane, sending coffee spilling across the polished floor. Sparks flew from the dashboard as the remaining engine fought to stabilize the descent. Richard felt a wave of vertigo, then a sharper realization: this was bigger than any boardroom, any contract, any ego. Lives were literally in his hands. His arrogance, which had insulated him for decades, offered no protection here. Humility became his weapon, focus became his ally, and courage, something he had often mistaken for fearlessness, was tested to the absolute limit. The pilot barked orders: "Adjust throttle. Compensate for the yaw." Keep her level. Richard responded with steady, calculated assistance, feeding him observations, noting every irregularity, and doing his best to remain calm. His daughter's terrified eyes met his, and in that instant, he understood the weight of responsibility in a way that money, power, or fear could never teach. The jet shuddered violently again, the fuselage groaning like a living thing in agony. Sparks shot across panels, and a sudden loud pop made everyone flinch. Panic threatened to consume them, but Richard's voice broke through the fear, not with authority, but with focus. Steady, steady, you've got this, he said to the pilot. Not commanding. Supporting. Human. Real. Minutes stretched into eternity. The world outside was a blur of clouds and terror, yet inside, the transformation was undeniable. The CEO who demanded control over lives and machines alike had become a collaborator, a student of survival, a human being recognizing limits and respecting skill. Finally, the pilot found a tenuous balance, stabilizing the failing aircraft enough to prepare for an emergency landing. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, sweat soaking his suit, yet he felt a strange clarity. He had confronted hubris, recognized the consequences of disrespecting expertise, and faced the true value of humility. Survival wasn't about dominance, it was about cooperation, observation, and moral courage. The jet descended steadily, though rough, toward a clearing below. Every fiber of Richard's being was focused, not on power, not on ego, but on life, on keeping everyone, including himself, alive. And as the ground rushed up, the impossible became possible. A critically damaged plane, lives hanging by a thread, and a man transformed in the crucible of chaos. In that moment, Richard realized that leadership wasn't about issuing orders. It was about presence, clarity, and respect for those who knew more than he did. If he survived, and he might, this lesson would never be forgotten. The jet shuddered violently one last time before settling onto the uneven terrain below. Dust and debris rose in clouds around the emergency landing site, and the passengers clung to their seats, bracing for impact. The landing was rough, metal groaned, tires skidded, and sparks flew, but remarkably, everyone survived. As the engines finally went silent, an eerie quiet replaced the roar of chaos. Richard Caldwell's chest heaved, sweat streaked across his brow, and for the first time in years, he felt a strange vulnerability, a recognition of how fragile life really was. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens and helicopter blades brought the reality of rescue. Emergency personnel moved swiftly, guiding passengers from the damaged jet to safety. Richard's daughter ran into his arms, trembling, and for the first time, he embraced her without a word, the silence between them speaking volumes. The assistant clutched her bag, pale but alive, while the board members exchanged nervous, relieved glances. Every individual bore the marks of terror, but survival, raw and unfiltered, united them. From a distance, Marcus Hayes watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had seen the signs, the hurried pre-flight checks, the shortcuts Richard demanded, and the consequences that followed. His principles had kept him from bending under pressure yesterday, and as he saw the CEO shaken, alive but humbled, a complicated wave of relief and vindication washed over him. He hadn't wished harm, but the stark lesson unfolding before him was impossible to ignore. Integrity mattered. Even in the face of powerful authority, standing by one's principles could be the difference between disaster and survival. Richard's mind raced. The adrenaline had faded, leaving space for reflection, and with it, clarity. The arrogance that had ruled him, the need to control, the dismissal of expertise, the blind ambition, had led directly to this near tragedy. For the first time, he understood that leadership was not a license to dominate, but a responsibility to protect, guide, and respect those around him. He had gambled lives for the sake of ego, and the gamble had almost cost him everything. Around him, the passengers began to process what had happened. Conversations were hesitant, emotional, reflective. Richard joined in, not to assert authority, but to listen, to learn. He asked questions about the emergency landing, the pilot's decisions, and safety procedures. His curiosity was sincere, his demeanor humbled. The lesson was clear. Knowledge and collaboration were far more valuable than dominance and fear. As helicopters carried some passengers away and ground teams secured the site, Richard cast a final glance at the wreckage. The twisted metal, the scorch marks, and the scars of near disaster were stark reminders of his own hubris. He had survived, But he would never forget the lesson Marcus, and the near tragedy, had delivered. Leadership, respect, and integrity weren't just abstract concepts, they were matters of life and death. In the days following the emergency landing, Richard Caldwell's world had shifted. No boardroom, no high-rise, no polished contract could erase the lessons seared into his consciousness. He held a press conference, facing cameras, microphones, and questions he could no longer dismiss with arrogance. "I made mistakes," he said, voice steady but humbled. "I allowed my ego and desire for control to cloud my judgment, putting lives at risk. I want to assure everyone, my team, my family, and the public, that I am committed to change. Leadership is about responsibility, not authority." The media buzzed, analysts debated, but inside the company, something subtler yet more profound was unfolding. Employees, who had once walked on eggshells under Richard's gaze, began to notice a shift. Meetings were collaborative, voices were encouraged, and decisions were no longer dictated but discussed. Authority still existed, but it was tempered with respect, not fear. Marcus Hayes received an unexpected message from the CEO himself, an offer to reconcile, to return under improved conditions. Marcus considered it carefully, thinking of the near disaster, the principles he had stood by, and the lesson Richard had now publicly acknowledged. After a pause, he replied politely but firmly, "I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot compromise my principles. I hope the company thrives under the new leadership you've promised." By standing his ground, Marcus reminded everyone watching, especially the audience witnessing the story on YouTube, that integrity is non-negotiable, even when faced with opportunity or temptation. Richard reflected quietly, no longer the infallible figure he had once imagined himself to be. He had confronted hubris, witnessed human fragility, and learned that real leadership required listening, respect, and humility. He began instituting new training programs, safety protocols, and open forums for employees to speak without fear. The mistakes of the past were now anchors, keeping him grounded in the present and focused on meaningful leadership. And yet, the story left a lingering thought. Authority, power, and wealth cannot shield one from the consequences of arrogance. Even the mightiest can falter, but courage, integrity, and ethical action, not fear or control, define true leadership. For viewers, the lesson was clear: respect boundaries, value expertise, and recognize the human element in every decision. In the end, Marcus's principles and Richard's humility stood as contrasting pillars, showing that the greatest victories in life are not won in boardrooms, but in the choices we make when everything hangs in the balance.